everyone. Welcome. My name is Kelsey Mesher. I'm the Advocacy Director at Transportation Choices Coalition, and I want to thank you for joining us here for our last transit chat of 2020. Can't believe we made it here. Today we're focusing on legislative session preview. We will be talking to you about our clean and just transportation agenda, as well as some goodies about how session is going to work. So I think it should be a really interesting hour for you. For those of you who don't know us, Transportation Choices Coalition is a statewide nonprofit working to bring sustainable, healthy, and accessible transportation options to people across Washington. We know that access to reliable and affordable transportation means access to opportunity to live full and healthy lives. Today, TCC is thrilled to be co-hosting our transit chat along with the Climate Alliance for Jobs and Clean Energy, of which we are a member organization. The Climate Alliance was formed in 2014 and is a coalition of environmental advocates, labor unions, health professionals, businesses, faith communities, and communities of color working with tribal nations to build a resilient climate justice movement. The Alliance works to pass policies that combine deep carbon reductions with advances for workers, low-income communities, and communities of color, those who are disproportionately bearing the impacts of pollution and climate change. So before we dive in, we would like to take a moment and acknowledge that while we are gathering here virtually, it is important to draw attention to the physical spaces where we are occupying. Myself and our panel are joining from the ancestral lands of the Duwamish Coast Salish people. I would invite you to acknowledge the land where you are in the chat box. Indigenous people are still here, many still fighting for federal recognition, and we cannot achieve mobility for all without recognizing and honoring those that first navigated this land. In addition, I wanted to acknowledge other urgent and relevant issues going on because there is a lot going on today. First, that though the news cycle has moved on from protests of the summer, Black Americans are still being unjustly harmed and killed as the result of white supremacy here in the United States. And we know that many harmful and lethal outcomes for Blacks are the result of interactions with the transportation system. In addition, we've reached a very grim milestone in the COVID pandemic with more than 300,000 Americans now having died of the disease. We know that disparities have been laid bare during this pandemic with Black and Brown and Indigenous people contracting and dying at disproportionately high rates. So just want to take a couple of breaths to just to give a moment for this context. Racism and police violence and structural inequity are pervasive. They are touching all parts of our lives and our work right now. And as advocates and policy experts, we have a great responsibility to take an anti-racist approach to our work, and we have a lot of work to do. So with that context setting, I'm going to get onto our webinar. We will be taking questions in the chat. This is being recorded and the video will be sent out and available on our website. And captions are available if you select the captions button at the bottom of your screen. Now on to transportation. So it should be no surprise to most of you watching today, transportation is Washington State's #1 source of climate pollution, and that pollution disproportionately impacts communities who live near roadways, port facilities, and railways. And those are predominantly low income and communities of color. And not only that, transportation funding in our state is broken. Funding is declining. Washington continues to overwhelmingly prioritize spending what limited revenue we do have on new roads and highway expansion. And we also face challenges through a number of limiting restrictions on our transportation funding. One of those we talk about frequently is the 18th Amendment, which restricts gas tax revenues to highway spending only. Pair that with large budget holes due to COVID impacts, and we have a lot to work on. We have a lot ahead of us. And so to address these challenges in our transportation system, we know we can't do it alone. We need to build collaborative multi-sector coalitions, which is why I'm really excited to be moderating this great panel of speakers and advocates today. Many of us have been working on transportation for years, but too often advocating in silos. As many of you know, TCC has a strong focus on mobility for people, but others on this call have been working on electrification or other broader climate policies. Often in the past, we have been pitted against one another, asked to trade off one environmental win for another. But this group really came together acknowledging that to achieve real transformation, we cannot accept one win over another win. We really need to look holistically at how we are building a transportation system that will be sustainable, accessible for people, and that corrects for historic racism. We are calling this holistic vision the Clean and Just Transportation Campaign, and that's what we're going to focus on today. And I just wanted to mention that the Clean and Just Transportation Campaign is just one of the pillars that the Climate Alliance for Jobs and Clean Energy is working on. You can look at its full Resilient Futures platform by visiting the website and signing up for updates. So with all of that introduction, I want to turn to our panelists. If you could please introduce yourselves, including your pronouns, tell us what organization you represent, and also tell us what perspective are you bringing to this coalition. And I'm going to just call on a few of you here. Let's start with Leah, Rebecca, and then Adrian.
Sure. Hi, everybody, and thank you so much to the audience for joining and listening in to this important webinar on this important topic, I hope. My name is Leah Misik. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Washington Transportation Policy Manager at Climate Solutions. As far as perspectives that I bring, of course, I am very deeply concerned and care very deeply about our future and frankly our present. The climate crisis is having real impacts right now, and so that's something I try to carry with me in my work all of the time. I'm constantly doing decarbonization model analysis and things like that, and it's really really obvious that we need to act now quickly and in a way that's equitable. So thinking a lot about that, but also, as folks can probably see my background, I also love biking. I love using transit, and at the same time, I grew up in an area that had no transit. It was transit score 0, walk score 0. So bringing in the understanding that we need a lot of different solutions to solve the climate crisis.
Thanks, Leah, and thanks, Kelsey, for your introduction and grounding all of us before we start. My name is Rebecca Ponzio. I'm the Climate and Fossil Fuel Program Director at Washington Environmental Council, Washington Conservation Voters, and I use she, her pronouns. And the perspective I bring is as organizations that work on the policy and the political side of the equation. Transportation is such an instrumental, has such an instrumental impact on all of us, on how we get around, on our pocketbooks, on the health of our rivers and our salmon populations. It really, it really represents a key system that needs to be brought into the 21st century for community health, for climate action, and for resiliency of our state. So I bring that combined perspective of all the suite of impacts of our transportation system and the importance, as Kelsey said, of our coalition, that we need each other, we are powerful together, and we actually can make change together.
So well said, Rebecca. Hello, everyone. We hope that you all are taking great care at this time. My name is Adrian Hampton. I use she, her pronouns, and I have the great honor of working in community with the Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition as the Climate Policy and Engagement Manager. The perspective I bring is, I think, a very collaborative one. It's highly intersectional and ever-growing cross-cultural perspective. This is so important because, you know, we as human beings are not impacted by just one issue. Therefore, we must continue to work and grow meaningful involvement of communities, so youth and those living in close proximity to environmental hazards must continue to grow this involvement in the decision-making process.
Great, thanks. Let's go to Vlad and then Bryce and Paulo.
Hi, all. I am Vlad Goop in Britain, he, him. I am the, pardon me, Climate and Infrastructure Advisor to the Washington State Labor Council. The State Labor Council is the largest labor organization in the state of Washington. We represent 550,000 workers in every corner of our state. And, you know, those workers have a vested interest in the future of transportation. They are people who build roads and transit systems. They are bus drivers and people who operate our transportation system and help maintain it. And they are transit users and transportation system users. And so we come at this, we come at the challenge of the transportation sector from all of those sides, and we really want to focus on worker-first policies that really prioritize the needs of working people, their need to get around affordably, their need to be able to access work and their livelihood and things like that. And so we really, our organization is committed to climate action, to climate justice, and the transportation infrastructure system that really lifts up our prosperity in the state in an equitable and progressive fashion. So excited to work with all these folks and so many of you tuning in to listen.
Hi, thank you, and welcome everybody. It is exciting to be with so many other amazing panelists today. My name is Bryce Hayden. I work with Transportation Choices Coalition as their lobbyist or state level government affairs consultant. I think, you know, Kelsey went into a lot of what TCC's perspective is, but I think a couple of additions, really looking at how the transportation system impacts other policy decisions across the state, like land use, and as Rebecca said, you know, climate policy and rivers and waterways and all of that fun stuff and how it interconnects is what I bring here. And I look forward to sharing more with you in a bit.
Hey everybody, my name is Paulo Nunes. Bueno. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm working with Front and Centered on transportation and land use policy for the organization. So Front and Center is a coalition of community groups of people of color throughout the state, and we focus on climate justice and environmental justice, and transportation is a huge part of that. Looking forward to working with all of you.
Fantastic. Thank you everyone for your introductions and for bringing such diverse perspectives to this coalition. Well, let's dive into the clean and just transportation agenda. So, you know, there's a lot of discussion about what the next transportation package is going to look like. How are we going to raise new revenue and how are we going to spend it? So that's what Clean and Just focuses on. And so let's first dive into the revenue side. And I'm going to ask Leah and Rebecca and Bryce to kick us off. You know, how are we looking at generating new revenue in a way that reduces emissions and air pollution, improves multimodal transportation, and ensures fair and equitable outcomes?
Great, thank you, Kelsey. I think I will kick it off to kind of go over some principles or recommendations that the Climate Alliance and the Clean and Just Transportation Group has been working on and put forward this year to really kind of frame the conversation on what we're looking for in revenue. I think the first thing that we need to think about is how do we move away from the volatile taxes that we inherently have in Washington State? You know, we know that the gas tax is a declining revenue source due to fuel efficiency, and things like electric vehicles that aren't, you know, paying that. So we have to look at that, but we're also seeing the impacts based on the current pandemic and how, you know, other areas of our tax policy is really implicated in that. We also want to focus on moving away from restricted revenues. As many people know, the 18th Amendment defines how we can spend gas tax and motor vehicle funds. So, moving away from something that is siloed and looking at it holistically and understanding how our transportation budget and our transportation and mobility options are inherently entwined, and we need to find revenue sources that really function that way as well. I think another one is prioritizing progressive revenue sources and structures so that the revenue burden does not disproportionately fall on low-income payers. As we know, with much of what I just said in terms of sales tax and other sources, we do tend to, in Washington State, focus and have our tax code impact certain income levels at higher rates. We want to make sure and ensure revenues and implementation do not exacerbate disproportionalities for people of color, immigrants, refugees, as well as low income, disabled, elderly, and the unbanked residents. And this includes things in engagement and policy design, monitoring and evaluation. And again, these are the principles we're using when we talk about how do we review new revenue sources that might come forward for us, as well as what things we would like to see move forward. I think the final two real quick are use charges and rate structures to address environmental and social impacts of transportation. These include things like greenhouse gas emissions, local air pollutants, congestion, injuries, death, and stormwater runoff. And the final is ensure revenue sources do not negatively impact workers and small businesses to make sure that we are not concentrating the impacts on certain groups.
Thanks, Bryce. And I guess I'll just chip in then with some specific policies that we believe fall under those principles, and we are looking forward to advocating for and shaping this upcoming legislative session and beyond. So I'll mention a few, although you can certainly, the audience can read more on our webpage, which is found on the Climate Alliance's webpage. We have our principles and our revenue and investment suggestions up there. But two policies I will highlight. One is the air quality surcharge. This is a policy that is being discussed right now, and we are looking forward to helping shape it and hopefully seeing it pass. As Bryce mentioned, one of the really big barriers right now to funding transportation options is we don't have very many flexible sources of revenue. The gas tax must be spent on highway projects. And so we're looking for sources of revenue that are able to be flexibly spent, but also hopefully in generating them are climate friendly. And so that's where we're coming from with the air quality surcharge. Basically what this surcharge is, it's a one-time charge on the purchase of new vehicles that accounts for their lifetime carbon emissions. So this is an important thing because we would be incentivizing cleaner vehicles at the point of purchase when people are making that decision. So it's climate friendly in this way, but we also want to make sure that it is a progressive policy, and that's why we're applying it to new vehicles. We have found that the average purchaser of a new vehicle is about in the 80th percentile of income, but we could also consider ability to pay provisions as well, just to make sure that this policy is truly progressive. But we think this is a climate friendly policy. It will generate flexible revenue that can be spent on multimodal options, and it will also hopefully help tip our decision making in a more climate friendly manner at the point of sale for these vehicles. So that's one revenue option that we are looking for. In addition to the air quality surcharge, one topic that has been discussed a lot that we are really closely watching and trying to help shape is the road usage charge. This has been under discussion for years, and we believe there's a lot of promise in a road usage charge, but it has to ascribe to our principles that Bryce outlined. So one really important qualifier for us on a road usage charge is we want to make sure that that money is not restricted to highway purposes only. We really need to fund a flexible transportation system that works for us all and includes many options. And so we want to make sure that any revenue coming out of a road usage charge is not fully restricted. We also want to make sure that with the road usage charge, we're able to sort of correct problems that we are already seeing in our revenue options, notably the gas tax. One thing we could do with the road usage charge, because it's focused at an individual, is we can actually account for the ability to pay and have a progressive revenue structure within a road usage charge. We could also make sure that vehicles that are heavier and have more impacts on the road pay a slightly higher rate and incentivize smaller vehicles in that way. But there's a lot of things to consider with a road usage charge. We also want to make sure that folks' data and their privacy is adequately protected. We want to make sure that it's an easy system to access for everybody, no matter whether or not you have a cell phone, no matter how you typically pay for things. So just wanted to to put that out there as something that we are really closely monitoring, and we think there's a lot of promise with it. We think it will help address some of our political and environmental and social challenges, but we certainly need to keep an eye on it and make sure that we're influencing it in a positive way. So helping with that regard.
Thanks, Leah. I would just add another important revenue option that we would support if it followed our principles is a carbon fee. And part of that is rationale is that greenhouse gas emissions are disproportionately coming from our transportation sector. So in order to reduce our emissions, it makes sense to have a revenue source that taxes that climate pollution and then invests in climate-friendly solutions in our transportation sector. In order to have that type of revenue source make sense, though, within the transportation world, it does need to be equitable. It needs to account for disproportionate impacts to people who have a harder time paying and lower income people, et cetera. And it needs to be framed in a way that really is tied to equitable investments in transportation. Revenue, we know that the state is as Bryce said, facing a serious economic recession. Revenue is going to be very important, a very important conversation this upcoming session. And we have heard over and over again that while there is support for climate action, it's important that when you're generating revenue based on climate pollution, those investments actually go to reducing those emissions. So there's a lot of kind of criteria to put around a carbon fee, just like the other revenue sources that Leah named. The other thing I wanted to mention or lift up is because of our current funding system for transportation, we really lack this flexibility to invest in all the different priorities that we have. So it's important not to think about generating new revenue as a replacement for gas tax, which would potentially tie it to the 18th Amendment, but instead generating new revenue is important in order to invest in the variety of priorities that we'll be talking about on this panel, and not have it fall into the same trap that other revenue sources are in right now in our transportation budget. Finally, the last thing I wanted to add is I think there's an important question of looking at our existing revenue sources to see how they can be strengthened and improved, make sure that they're going to the priorities that they should be going to. For example, maintenance and preservation, making sure that our current revenue actually is able to address that big gap in our transportation sector.
Great, thanks everyone so much for that overview. Well, caveat that we may not have all of the funds that we want, but I want to turn to the investment side. If Vlad and Paulo and Adrian, could you talk for a few minutes about, what is the kind of holistic vision for investing to create a clean and just transportation system? What are the different buckets that we need? How are we approaching investments?
That's such a great question, Kelsey. I would say first and foremost, the prioritization process getting started starts with cultivating knowledge and building community power to ensure community has a lead role in providing recommendations for equitable access, as well as active and healthy ways to get around in order to then prioritize intersectionality for comprehensive investments. Otherwise said, how can we look at transportation as a platform for health and wellness as well? So this is all to say systems of community resilience built by community to resist climate injustice cannot be done without clean and just investments. So we really need this. People living in urban and rural Washington should have a diverse options to get around. So they can access opportunities like healthcare, good jobs, education, and live in a sustainable climate. So there's a lot of ways to get there, including protecting tribal treaty rights, as well as cultivating community values in proposed frameworks and aligning investments with anti-displacement strategies and increasing accountability and transparency. There's so much. Paulo, what do you think about this?
I say yes to everything that Adrian just said twice. And I guess the only thing that I would say is that we'd like to be very intentional and actually call out that a percentage of the investments, 35%, should go to vulnerable communities and those communities that are defined by the Clean Energy Transition Act and the Environmental Justice Task Force, so that we're not just saying that these are the investments that we should make sure that we direct them at specific communities that have been underinvested in and that have been exposed more to pollution than the rest of the state. Vlad?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what's been said. I mean, I think one of the sort of important things to keep in mind about the opportunity that a transportation revenue and investment package presents is that we are as everyone on the call knows, in the midst of an historic economic recession that is really hurting a lot of people, that is challenging people's ability to make ends meet. And it's time for us it's important, it's critical for Washington our legislature to really rise to the occasion. And that means not a cuts-oriented budget, but an investment-oriented budget. We have an opportunity to come out of this recession with deep investments in our infrastructure that allows Washington and all of us to prosper and to really share that wealth and prosperity broadly, which means that, there'll be parts of the budget of the transportation revenue package that will focus on roads. When we do that, instead of prioritizing always building new roads, we really need to put preservation and maintenance front and center, because those are the projects that can start now and put people to work and create economic benefits across our state immediately, and support a transportation system that is more connected. We need to be making deep investments in electrification so that we reduce our continued reliance on fossil fuels and improve air quality in the process. We need expansive investments in concentration in transit to support those people who work in those systems, but also populations that are transit dependent and populations that would benefit from being able to opt out of having to own and operate a vehicle. It costs $9,000 on average to have a car every year, and those folks that are able to kind of switch to transit, they get to keep more of those resources for themselves and their families and their communities. And those are some of the opportunities that if we kind of really structure transportation policy in the right way, we're both lifting up workers, we're both lifting up communities that are burdened by our regressive tax code and by our dependence on pollution, and we're fighting climate change too. Those are all things that we can do if we properly integrate these goals together. And a transportation package is sort of a unique opportunity to do that, along with other parts of the budget. But we can't just have maintenance level spending. We have to make sure that we are making a generational investment in connecting people to where they work and where they play and where they want to go.
Great, thanks everyone. Okay, we've talked about kind of what the clean and just transportation agenda looks like. I want to turn toward how we might get this done and what the challenges are going to be this year, and a little bit of the kind of behind the scenes, how is session going to work? We've upended our lives, everything is different, and this year's legislative session will be all remote. Bryce and Leah, you are really in the thick of it. Can you tell us what will session look like? What is the governor's involvement going to be? Are there notable new electeds we should be looking at in terms of transportation? Any insights you want to share?
Yeah, I'll start with a couple of things and then, hand it back to Leah, and then everybody obviously can chime in with some of the work that they're doing. But as you said, Kelsey, we are facing a very different session than I have ever participated in about the last 12 years I've been doing this. I think the big highlight is that all committee hearings and all floor action will be done via Zoom, and we'll be watching on TVW from wherever we might be at that time instead of in the hallways or in committee hearings testifying. And that kind of presents, I think, a couple of opportunities, but probably a couple of major hurdles as we move forward. I think, an opportunity for more engagement more broadly with the general public will be exciting to see, and seeing that engagement and hearing different points of view and adding different perspectives will be fantastic. But I also think there's going to be some stumbling blocks as we move through this. Things like, how do we make sure that we're getting all the information to legislators on time and in a manner that is easily accessible for them and for the general public? Typically, when we're testifying, it's pretty well known. We have our time frame. We know what we're going to say. We know who's in the room with us, and all of that's kind of taken away. So it'll be very interesting to see how coalitions continue to build and form as session moves through the day-to-day business. And I think, what's interesting right now is that I think as we gear up, the governor right now is setting out a whole host of priorities that he wants to see move forward. He has a kickoff here in a little bit regarding some of his climate priorities. But I think we're also going to see how he wants to address the $700 million shortfall in the transportation budget that we're facing, or what are we going to do moving forward in regards to how we want to spend and focus on climate, like I just mentioned. So I think he's going to be heavily involved. I just think we're going to see a different engagement level from both legislators, folks on the ground, lobbyists, advocates, but also greater ability for the general public. And I think the final piece that I will say that we're still kind of piecing together is there's going to be the ability to kind of submit not so much real-time comments, but really provide an opportunity that instead of testifying, you'll be providing comments to the committee while the committee is hearing a bill. So we're going to have new opportunities to engage that maybe we don't always need to testify. Maybe it's better that we give long details in terms of turning over our written testimony. So that's some of the things we're going to be facing that's interesting. I think Leah has other things that she'll talk about, and then we can hit on some of the new legislators and their roles in the Transportation Committee.
Yeah, thanks, Bryce. So I absolutely agree. There's a lot of things that we can anticipate being different with the virtual session, but certainly also a lot of things that remain to be seen that we'll have to adapt to and do a little trial and error and see how what's effective and what works in getting our priorities across. I will say one thing that we are anticipating being a little more difficult this session is because of the nature of virtual session, we are expecting less bills to be heard. And there's a lot of things that we really need to address in Washington State. Not only do we have to address the climate crisis imperative and address our transportation needs as we're talking about here, but we really need to address a whole host of other issues, including addressing the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. We really have to address a lot of issues that have come up and have continued to show with just a new focus now on racial equity. I will say I'm really heartened that we have had a lot of discussion coming into session on racial equity and on climate and how those things interact with each other. And I think there's a lot of energy around these topics, even though, I think a lot of folks are thinking, well, given COVID, given the economy, maybe we can't focus on climate, or we can't necessarily focus on equity. But I think we're seeing the opposite. I think there's a lot of passion around this and a lot of folks within and outside of the legislature who will be pushing on these topics and understanding that everything is connected. So I think there's a lot of momentum here. I also think there is the challenge in that we are adapting to this new system and we might not be able to hear as many bills as we typically will. So that's why we're really pushing for some bold visions and some really strong bills to make sure that what does get through is progressive, is equitable, is climate friendly, and understanding that all of these things are linked together. I also will say that, I'll turn it over back to Bryce in a minute on this, but I will say overall, we have high hopes for the incoming class of legislators as well. Many folks also know that we didn't see any change in sort of party alignment this session, but I will say out of the folks who are elected, sort of the flavor of people who are elected, I think will be stronger on clean transportation and stronger on climate. I think we have a few new legislators who have a real passion for that, and they have been they've been placed on the environment and the transportation committees. So for us, that's really great news. We'll have some new partners that are eager and ready to go to work with. So I think that will be a great thing as well.
Yeah, and a couple other things that I forgot to mention real quick, just in terms of day-to-day and what we're facing in 2021. It's a long session. We have to do our new biennial budget, so we're going to be addressing some of those. It's a minimum of not a minimum. The session has a maximum of 105 days to get both of the budgets passed and any related bills. As Leah mentioned, I think there's going to be a lot of concentration and trying to focus on key areas that she brought up. You know, they're talking anywhere from about a third of the amount of bills passed. So, you know, around 200 as opposed to, you know, the 5 to 6 that we typically see. Wait, are my numbers right? I'll think about that in a second. Hold on. But we're really going to see a shift. And I think that the one thing I think we need to watch for and some of the interactions we're going to have, well, at the state level, but it's also going to be dependent a little bit on federal investment, is what is our budget gap going to be, both on the operating side, capital budget side, transportation side even. You know, there's a lot of conversations on infrastructure investments at the federal level, and also what local governments need. We know that this pandemic has impacted local jurisdictions' ability to meet the needs of today, and seeing how that's going to play in, I think, will really impact the length of our 2021 session. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see it running a little bit longer as we wait to see where money comes from coming down from the federal government. So I think those are a couple other additions that we need to think about. And as Leah said, and I think others know this, on the House Transportation side, we have 4 new members that have been put on to the House Transportation. They're really good folks. I think that we're going to see some new ideas. We have Taylor out of the 30th, which is Federal Way, and parts of South King County. Hackney, Representative-elect Hackney, who is out of the 11th, who takes over for other portions of South King County. We have Representative-elect Berry, who is from the 36th, and I know that she is raring to go. And then we have a new member out of the 28th. We actually have 2 members out of the 28th, one out of the Senate and one out of the House, that'll be on transportation. Bernofsky, and then over on the Senate side, we actually have Twina Nobles, who is taking over for Steve Oban. So we have some really new, interesting voices coming up on transportation, and especially on the Senate side, and the refocus, hopefully, on prioritizing mobility and transit and people.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Anyone want to jump in and add anything else on session strategy, how we're going to get done? Otherwise, we're going to move to our lightning round.
I'll just add, you know, we did deepen the bench because of this election. We deepened the bench of elected officials who are committed to this work, and that bodes well for all of us as advocates to move our work forward. I think the local elected officials' voices are going to be very important in helping advance equitable and just transportation package as well. And Pierce County has some newly elected officials that are really kind of uniquely positioned, frankly, in this work as an important county overall. So as advocates, engaging people, leaders, community groups at all scales to weigh into session. To me, that's a silver lining of this horrible, horrible year of a pandemic, that there's actually more access to these hearings and to testimony because it's now remote. You don't actually have to travel to Olympia. And so all of us working to tap into that energy and that accessibility is part of our challenge.
Great, thanks so much. So much knowledge and experience here. Okay, well, we are going to get to audience questions very shortly. So if you do have a question, please drop it into the chat. Before we get there, I'm gonna do something a little different, which is a couple of lightning round questions. So we're gonna just do this very quickly. This first one is going to be painful because I'm going to make you state what is another major policy you are advocating for this session, but I'm not going to allow you to talk about it for very long. So I just want to hear, what else are you working on that folks in the audience are probably tracking as well. And we'll go the same order: Leah, Rebecca, Adrian, Vlad, Bryce, Paulo.
I'm really excited about the clean fuel standard. That's a top priority for climate solutions and is also one of the environmental priority coalition priorities.
And I will add, I'm excited about a focus on the budget overall. It's required for the legislature to pass it, and there's a lot of important work there.
I'm very excited for the HEAL Act, a healthy environment for all, committing state agencies to adopt a mission of environmental justice.
Is it me?
Vlad, Bryce, Paulo.
Oh, okay.
Oh, I'm up. Labor Council is we're working on progressive revenue. We're working on a bill called the Worker Protection Act to make sure that workers' rights and safety measures are protected, even when the state doesn't have the capacity to enforce them themselves.
An additional thing that TCC is working on is a continuation of last year, which is a review of some of our transportation policy goals and seeing how we can turn that into transportation investments moving forward, and seeing how we can do more of our transportation for all bill work from last year.
And Front and Centered is really happy to be collaborating with lots of the folks on the call today to make sure that environmental justice and climate justice are included in the GMA reauthorization. In the Growth Management Act reboot.
Okay, my next question, this is if you could do a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Do you think the legislature will pass a transportation package in the 2021 session? Ooh, I'm seeing a lot of this. I'm seeing Bryce, why are you leaning, why are you tilting upwards?
I think you know, I don't know if we're going to see necessarily a full revenue, something like 15 or 20 years, like some of the, but if we see certain revenue sources moving forward, I think that we're going to see some significant transportation investments, some kind of in that, depending on what revenues move forward, depends on how much we invest in transportation. So that's where I'm leaning right now.
Got it. All right, and who is more here? I want to hear a skeptic. Leah?
I was more neutral because I don't like to make predictions. And so we'll work for it and go with what happens.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, I think we're going to turn to some audience questions because they are coming in. While we do some audience Q&A, I did want to say, you know, thank you so much for listening so far. I know a few people have asked how you can get involved. We need you to get involved. We need everyone to stay engaged. This is going to be, we all need to stick together to achieve these goals. So we're going to drop an action into the chat. This is our first action of the year. It's a simple email to your representatives telling them that you support a clean and just transportation agenda. And if you take that action, you will be helping us out with this work, and you'll also get signed up for email updates throughout the legislative session. So please try to take that action over the next couple minutes here. And I'm going to turn to an audience question. So I think in just a couple of minutes, Governor Inslee is going to announce his climate agenda. How will this agenda affect these transportation priorities, and any hints or ideas on what he's going to announce? Anyone want to jump in? Vlad?
Sure. So I mean, we'll learn with many of you what the governor's full proposal looks like, but we do know that Governor Inslee has a long track record of commitment to action on climate change. He recognizes has communicated to many of us the need to invest in transportation and the economic and equity and climate opportunity that is incorporated in that pathway. You know, I think we can expect from him to see policy to address electrification and transportation emissions directly. That includes, Leah mentioned earlier, the clean fuel standard, something that he has in the past been very strongly supportive of. He's likely to build on the state energy strategy that the state is close to finalizing adoption of right now, That's been a public process. Some of the folks on this call are actually participating in some of the sort of advisory panel. Rebecca, for example, and others are active participants in that. And there are a lot of recommendations in there that chart the future of energy use in the state of Washington, including in the transportation sector. And so we would expect the governor to kind of look forward at implementing those solutions. A lot of those solutions are aligned with what we've talked about. They include clean fuels and electrification of transportation, reduced reliance on single occupancy vehicles through investments and things like in transit, and other policy priorities. They also talk about a low carbon transition for buildings and reducing the reliance on fossil fuels in our building sector and industry and places like that. So we would really expect, as in years past, a comprehensive agenda that is pointed at the goals of the governor requested last year, which require a 95% emission reduction by 2050 and net zero emissions by then, and implementing that strategy, which is close to being finalized. I know other people, like I mentioned, have been active participants in that, so I hope others will add. But that's the kind of scale of ambition that I think we can expect this afternoon from him.
Great, thanks. I'll move on to our next question, which is about freight. Is there any environmental justice priority addressing the impacts of long-haul diesel trucks? Obviously, those are disproportionate emitters. In California and other states, there are zero emissions freight policies gaining momentum. What is going on here in Washington?
I can quickly start with that, and then Paulo perhaps can chip in as well. We have been doing a lot of work surrounding the impacts of transportation on air pollution, which is definitely disproportionately felt by communities of color and low-income communities. We have been doing this work at the state, but a lot of the organizations on this call, including Front and Centered and the Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition, have also been working with advocating at the port for port operations to clean up as well. So I will say, from climate solutions perspective, we have certainly been the clean fuel standard, we believe, would help reduce particulate matter from transportation pollution. We also have been really pushing to help electrify heavy duty vehicles and port vehicles, and grant programs and funding programs for those that would not only help electrify those vehicles, but help the workers make that transition in a just way as well. So they pay lower operating costs, but aren't saddled with the upfront costs of the more expensive right now vehicle. So we've been doing a lot of cooperative work on that, not just at the state level, but at various different levels. I also do want to note that last session we had a victory where we passed the zero emissions vehicle mandate, which binds us to California standards. And California is actually working on implementing a new clean truck rule, which we're hoping to see come forward in Washington state as well. So continuing to push for zero emission vehicle mandate related policies too.
Great, thanks. Paulo, did you want to add anything?
Well, I really appreciate the question, and I, obviously support everything that Leah said, and I wanted to just add that it's important that we also have really clear accountability and monitoring systems when it comes to localized pollution and to what we call the co-pollutants. I think that from a climate justice, environmental justice perspective, we would like to say that the greenhouse gases are the co-pollutants of the particulate matters, of the NOxes and SOxes that make people sick. And the interesting thing is that these are very closely tied together, but our ability to monitor localized particulate matter, localized pollutants, is much greater than our ability to measure greenhouse gas emissions. So if we could focus on cleaning up the areas that are really making people sick, that have been disproportionately impacted for generations because of our history of racist policies, of racist land use planning, then we will also be making great strides towards climate. So I think it's really important not only to have these policies in place, but make sure that we have a very, very clear monitoring protocol.
Thank you. Thanks for that addition. I want to return to the topic of the road usage charge. I think this is something that elicits a lot of gut reactions, and everyone kind of imagines their own how it's going to impact them individually, whether you're living in the suburbs, in a city, somewhere rural. So, could you talk about how would a road usage charge work when if urban drivers drive less and maybe tend to be wealthier versus, balancing that with rural road users? How could you design a RUC that would, balance out also for income level? What are the policy choices associated with a road usage charge?
I think a couple of, yeah, go ahead, Paulo. I'll let you jump in and I was going to go ahead.
I guess the thing that we ought to all keep in mind is that there's a lot of work that needs to be done on a road use charge, but it can be a much more precise tool than your gas pump. Your gas pump doesn't know who you are, doesn't care who you are, doesn't know what kind of car you drive. It just cares that you want to buy gas. And a road use charge could be a much more sophisticated way to raise revenues in ways that are more equitable, in ways that reflect, obviously, how much you use of the transportation system, what time you're driving. There's all kinds of things, whether you have transit available in that portion of your trip. We could create a road use charge that is sensitive to whether people could have used transit for that portion of the trip. So there's a long ways for us to go in terms of designing this, but we shouldn't paint it with the same sort of broad brush that we have with our current ways of raising revenue, which are really dumb.
Thanks for that, Paulo. I think you were more eloquent in what I was going to say, but I think kind of on the second half of this is something we mentioned earlier, is when we look at how we do investments and once we implement the road usage charge. So there's two pieces of it. I think Paulo did a great job at framing some of the things we need to address when we're talking about implementation phases, but when we also think about what we're investing in and how we're getting to provide more mobility options for folks once we implement one, and making sure that there are, as Paulo said, are there alternative methods that are, efficient, effective, and easy for you to take versus some other areas of the state where we just really can't, you have to kind of rely on a vehicle under current circumstances. So understanding how we do those investments, I think, is going to be key. And that goes back to our conversation earlier, which is making sure we're not limiting the usage of the road usage charge to just highway purposes. And we're actually looking at our system holistically and how we invest in community-based transportation systems.
Great. At the risk of opening a giant discussion, but this did come up in the question, so I wanted to get it out there. The question is this the year for a carbon tax? There's also talk of cap and invest. What are the differences between them, and what is the viability of either of them happening this year?
I can jump in. This coalition has a long history of working on carbon pricing, and we are aligned around the need we're aligned around the support for a carbon fee or carbon tax. The Climate Alliance for Jobs and Clean Energy obviously brought Initiative 1631 forward, which, this coalition continues to support a framework like that. The reality is that that right now, because we do not have those kinds of mechanisms, the fossil fuel industry is able to continue to pollute while the rest of us have to pay for the consequences. And we've talked a lot today about what those consequences are, how they're disproportionately and unevenly borne. And so pricing remains something that many of us support and many of us continue to work on. There are a number of proposals that legislators are working on this year. They do include cap and invest. They include carbon fee, I believe, and bond proposal. And I know that while the Climate Alliance has not expressed or just settled on a specific preference among those, many of our groups have and are participating in those conversations. And we want to make sure that and I should say part of the reason they're coming up again is because pricing could be a fund source for many of the kind of transportation investments that we have described, which is why it's so relevant and so deeply connected to many of these issues that we've talked about. So, you know, we have a 105-day session that starts on January 11th, and pricing will certainly be a live portion of that discussion, probably for all 105 of those days. You know, we'll all continue to strive to work together and seek solutions that lift up the values that we have shared today.
Great, thank you. You know, you brought up, you know, big oil, and I'm wondering, you know, that kind of hints on another question that came up, which is, you know, what are going to be the major challenges to getting our clean and just transportation agenda moving forward? What are you anticipating? Who is our primary opposition, and what are we doing to prepare for that?
Well, to start, I'd love to contribute to make sure that whatever goes through is coming out of the pockets of those most responsible. And so often those impacted the most by the adverse health impacts of climate change contribute the least to the problem. And so we need to make sure that whatever moves forward is progressive, and those responsible parties are paying their fair share.
Yeah, I think that, you know, as we head into the session and the package that we're pushing forward, or and the set of recommendations and principles, I think, you know, one of the interesting things that we're doing is we have set it out as principles. We have a review structure that we're going to be doing as they release ideas or revenue or other things, and that's going to be key to just how we're going to approach sessions. So there's going to be a slight difference. You know, we're bringing forward ideas, but we're also going to be reviewing ideas that are brought forward by others to see if it falls within a framework. So that's going to be interesting, at least in an engagement perspective with the legislature. But I do want to highlight that there are going to be roadblocks. There is a continued push to, you know, over-invest in highway expansion and trying to work our way through, you know, educating and making sure members understand that, you know, a holistic transportation approach is really what we need to be doing if we want to meet our greenhouse gas target emissions, our vehicle miles traveled reduction goals, and, you know, beyond that, it's really just about functionally educating people on the needs of the transportation system and what are those needs. We know that, you know, according to a 2018 America's Community Survey, 33% of people who rode Metro were essential workers. And if we're talking about reduced bus service, we're talking about individuals who are out there on the front lines, either, you know, providing support in hospitals or, you know, ringing up our groceries that we need every single day. We could add an hour onto their day, and that just doesn't seem right anymore. So really it's focusing and making sure we're educated on those key points. There's going to be hurdles, and I think it's going to take a long time to fully transition to it. But I think we have a good coalition, and I really think fundamentally the coalition that we've worked within and built around these key priorities is what's going to make this strong and really passable this year.
I just really quickly wanted to add, we've mentioned it briefly, but I do want to name a big problem is the oil industry. They want to ensure that we continue to rely on their product. So they are objecting to expanding transportation choices for folks, objecting to increased vehicle efficiency and vehicle electrification, objecting to more transit, objecting to other climate policies. And I just wanted to remind folks that we know their opposition talking point. They're going to talk about how the price of gas is going to increase. And I want to remind everybody that in Washington, we see some of the highest profit margins per gallon of gas in the country. In the Seattle metropolitan area, they're making about an 80-cent per gallon profit. So I just want folks to keep that in mind. They are trying to maintain their near monopoly, and what we are looking to do is to make sure that folks have choices and that those choices are affordable and climate friendly.
Fantastic. Well, I think that we are going to end it there because our hour has wound down. I want to thank all of you on the panel for sharing your expertise with us. Please, if you have a question you didn't answer, reach out to us. Please sign up for our action alert so you can stay engaged throughout session. And, you know, as I mentioned, it's TCC's last transit chat is now done. You know, we have a lot of work ahead of us, not only legislative session, but work on policing and transportation, work on next generation ORCA, work on ensuring, you know, we have more funding for better bus service. The work never ends. And so as you are considering your end of year giving, if you could please also consider transportation choices among that, we would be so grateful. And I think finally, just in this wild world that we're living in, please take good care of yourselves and find some time to relax as the year winds down. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it.